some of these tomatoes in here are not like the others. And that's going to create a little bit of a tomato dilemma. So I'm back in the grow room and doing a little bit of an inspection on our tomato seedlings, which need to be up-potted here shortly. And I have found a bit of a tomato dilemma. So we have added a few new varieties this year to test out because we wanted to try a pink tomato. And two of the varieties that we added were the German pink and the pink brandywine. And this is a case of I didn't quite do enough research. Imagine that. But both varieties are what are called potato-leaved varieties. That in itself creates a little bit of a dilemma. These pineapple tomatoes in the front are the sort of more familiar leaf type. They're serrated around the edges, kind of what you expect from a tomato. But these pink brandywine tomatoes here have very different looking leaves. And essentially right there is what's considered potato leaf varieties. Now, botanically, these are all the same species. But the tomato has a bit of an interesting history which has sort of led to this proliferation of different varieties. So when I did some reading on this topic before making this video, there's apparently a little bit of controversy around tomatoes because most varieties are what are considered sort of inbreeding plants. Now, the historic versions of the tomato, as far as anybody is aware, were not inbreeding plants, i.e. they required outcrossing or they wouldn't set seeds. Most quote-unquote modern varieties of tomato, though, are quite happy to self-pollinate their own seeds. And essentially what happens, the difference between the old wild versions and the modern domestic versions, is the style length. So the style length is part of the flower, and on the inbreeding versions the styles are really short or almost absent in some cases. But on the potato leaf varieties, which are an older, if you were going to talk about heirloom, they're probably more of an heirloom than any of the modern short style varieties. But on those potato leaf varieties, the styles are really quite long, relatively speaking. So the flower is essentially a complete flower which is accessible to insects. And therein lies the dilemma, because tomatoes are one of those funny things where a lot of varieties don't cross, are very unlikely to cross. And sort of 3 meters is a general rule. If you can keep a lot of the modern sort of inbreeding type tomatoes 3 meters away from each other, you're basically guaranteed that they're not going to be pollinated by insects. Now keep in mind, in North America at least, tomatoes are not exactly prime candidates for insects. Most of the insects we have don't really like them. That doesn't mean they won't visit them though. But on these modern varieties, or these short-styled varieties, they can't really access the flower to pollinate it properly. Here comes the dilemma with the potato leaf varieties. Because they can access them, the separation distances are much, much higher. So instead of 3 meters, the recommendation is 50 meters, which is kind of a big deal, relatively speaking. And we have 2 varieties of potato-leaved tomatoes that have come up. So now with these pink brandywines and German pink tomatoes, we kind of have a bit of a decision to make. And in discussing it before we film this video, what we think we're going to do is isolate both varieties away from all of our other tomatoes, because technically, and this is where it gets kind of gray, because we have to separate the other tomatoes by 3 meters, because there is a small chance of cross-pollination. Obviously these potentially increase that chance. So for this year, these are going to be a trial, and we're not going to save seeds, and we're going to isolate them the 50 meters from everything else and see how we like them, and go from there, because there probably isn't room for us to do 2 potato leaf varieties in the same sort of garden space that we have. Now some of this probably sounds a little crazy, because a lot of people do notice, and it's actually in a lot of the literature on tomato seed saving, that some people will grow a whole hodgepodge of tomatoes and never really notice any crossing. And of course the wild card is what you have for pollinators, because You may not know all the insects you have and what insect is attractive or what insect is coming to it because there's nothing else. When you're trying to save seeds, you're better off to play it safe and try to use these separation distances. Interestingly, in doing the research for this video, I basically stumbled across that most of the Brandywine type tomatoes are indeed potato-leaved. And as I say, they're potentially more of a heirloom, so to speak, because they are an older variety or subgenre of tomato, because they're a little bit more like the ancestor of some of the modern tomatoes. For one species, there's a lot of variety, and it's not just in fruit, it's in growth habit and flower types as well. So certainly something to keep in mind if you're seed saving, at least be cognizant of, because as we say, for us, now we've got a little bit of a dilemma, and rather than waste both varieties, the plan is we're going to plant them together 50 meters away from everything else, so that we can basically ensure all of our other seed tomato crops are going to stay pure, and then we'll make a decision if we like either of these varieties enough. They might find a place in our repertoire of tomatoes, and if not, then it was still a good experiment, and no harm, no foul. But hopefully this is another one of those experiences where doing the research ahead of time, and I'm just as guilty, can really save you a lot of headache later, because if you didn't know that they were a potato leaf variety and you only planted them 3 meters apart, well, they could cross with everything else that you have going. When I say that tomatoes are sort of inbreeding plants, a lot of the modern varieties are, and they'll set fruit and produce seeds without any cross-pollination. And while the styles and whatnot are still very short, that limits access to things like bigger bumblebees and what have you. It doesn't eliminate some insects from accessing it, and then that's why there is sort of that recommended 3 meter separation distance for a lot of your tomato varieties. But essentially, you could have a very small insect still go from plant to plant to plant if they were right beside each other. The downside to these is, with the potato leaves, those same small insects could more easily get from plant to plant to plant, cross-pollinating. So, and of course, the last sort of closing thought on this is, why does this really matter? Well, if you're growing all these different varieties of tomatoes, or any kind of vegetable or animal, whatever it is you're growing, you're probably growing it for some of its unique qualities. In this case, color, taste, texture are kind of the big ones for tomatoes and potentially their end use. So keeping them pure makes sense when they're not all the same. Could make the argument that the German pink and the pink Brandywine are probably related somewhere. There's a good chance of that. But from what I have read, the pink Brandywine is kind of a mainstay favorite for a lot of people for flavor. So there's probably a reason for that. And that reason right there is why, when you're trying to be more sustainable and more self-sufficient and growing your own vegetables, knowing how to keep things pure matters. So for us, it's going to be an experiment in 2022, but we don't want our other tomatoes contaminated, so to speak, so we're going to follow the rules.